For 500 years, the entire world thought they knew an image completely. Hanging on the wall of an ancient hall in Milan, Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper seems untouchable. It is a pillar of our history, a chronicle frozen in time, sculpted by the hand of a genius. Every gaze, every gesture of the apostles, everything has been analyzed, debated, and interpreted to exhaustion. It was believed the case was closed, that the work had already surrendered all its secrets, but that certainty was about to shatter. We decided to treat the masterpiece differently, ignoring its artistic value and focusing on it as a crime scene, a data file encrypted 5 centuries ago whose message had never been read. For this task, we created a unique tool, an analytical intelligence system we named Pneuma. We fed it everything humanity has produced regarding Leonardo da Vinci, his diaries, his anatomical sketches, his inventions, and most importantly, every fragment of his famous mirror writing, the code he used to protect his thoughts. Then we handed the Last Supper over to it and asked just one question: what was truly there? To Leonardo, painting was just another way to create riddles. He saw the world as a grand puzzle. His notebooks are proof of a mind that delighted in hiding knowledge in plain sight, masking revolutionary ideas in diagrams and notes that took centuries to decipher. He used art as a vault to store his most dangerous ideas. And the Last Supper, the work that defined his career, would turn out to be his most impenetrable vault. He constructed this work in a way that defied its own time. Instead of using the traditional fresco technique, he applied his own paints over dry plaster. At first, the result was an explosion of color and life, but time took its toll, and the painting began to deteriorate very quickly. The paint started to fade and crack, even during Leonardo's lifetime. For centuries, this was seen as a tragic failure. No one imagined that these very cracks, this decay etched into the wall by time, were part of the disguise. Imperfection was the camouflage. In our laboratory in Florence, far from the calm of the church, the Da Vinci Decoded project began. Using hyperspectral imaging, a technology that sees through the layers of time, every millimeter of the painting was converted into terabytes of raw data. The Pneuma system began its work, crossing every pixel with the psychological and intellectual profile of its creator. Our search focused on one thing: technical anomalies, anything that shouldn't be there. For weeks, the results were exactly as expected. Pigment analysis, charcoal traces from preparatory sketches, details about the composition. It was academically valuable but predictable work. The team, led by Dr. Alessi, monitored the data with an already established routine until, on a quiet Tuesday, something changed. A discreet alert blinked on the main monitor. In an area of deep shadow, behind the figure of one of the minor apostles, Pneuma had flagged an irregularity. A small red circle pulsed on the screen. Dr. Helena Rossi, the project's chief historian, approached skeptically. She said it must be structural damage, a deeper crack, seeking the most logical explanation. But Pneuma was insistent. Minutes later, another red circle appeared in another dark corner, and a third, almost invisible, in the fold of a robe. They didn't follow natural aging patterns. There was a structure to them, a strange consistency that defied chance. The mood in the room grew heavy. The routine had been broken. Dr. Alessi felt the shift in atmosphere. He walked to the main console and gave a simple command for the machine to connect the patterns. For a moment, the system processed the data. Instead of images or geometric diagrams, the lines formed letters. Ghosts of letters, distorted by time and layers of paint, but unmistakably intentional. But what truly shocked us was their location. Leonardo didn't place them in a prominent spot. He buried them in the shadows, in forgotten corners, in places where the human gaze would never linger. It was like finding a secret message written on the wall of a vault, but from the inside. At that moment, everyone in the lab understood. It became clear that Leonardo had left those words on purpose. And as Numa began to decipher the first fragment, the admiration everyone felt for the painting turned into a chill down the spine. A real fear. What would a man like Leonardo need to hide so carefully in the shadows of his most sacred work? The silence in the laboratory was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the servers. On the screen, the ghostly letters seemed to float in the shadows of the Last Supper. They weren't sharp, but rather faint echoes. Dr. Helena Rossi, who dedicated her life to understanding Leonardo's mind, approached the monitor, her eyes fixed on the marks. She saw much more than letters. She saw the audacity of a man speaking across centuries. She whispered that it had been hidden on purpose. Nothing there was random. He wanted them to be found, but not by his time, by a time like ours. Dr. Alessi's first order was verification. Skepticism is the foundation of science. He initiated a rigorous validation protocol, ordering Numa to perform an authenticity analysis and compare the marks with Da Vinci's calligraphic database. It was to look for patterns of pressure, slant, and microstrokes. We needed to be absolutely sure that it wasn't a random pattern, a simple digital optical illusion. The machine obeyed. For hours the system worked, crossing millions of data points. It compared the genetics behind the letters, the unique stroke of the hand that would have made them. The result came back with 99.7% certainty. The marks were compatible with Leonardo's writing, specifically his famous mirrored technique. It was as if Numa had found a fingerprint left in the wet paint. The discovery was real. It was physically there, buried under the layers of the painting, waiting for an eye capable of seeing through stone. The news of the validation spread through the small team like a shockwave. What was once a curious anomaly was now an irrefutable fact. With authenticity confirmed, the decoding phase began. Numa started isolating the fragments, digitally cleaning the cracks and fading. The first words that emerged were short, isolated, but carried immense weight. From the darkness near Judas, the word betrayal glowed faintly. Near a dark window, the word shadow. And under the table, almost illegible, truth. They were like the first pieces of a monumental puzzle, words that echoed the painting's themes, but in a much more direct and raw way. The team gathered in the control room. The initial excitement gave way to deep unease. They were no longer just art historians. They had become guardians of a secret that could rewrite history. The decision was unanimous and immediate. The Da Vinci Decoded project would go into total lockdown. No information would leave that room. The Vatican, which had sponsored part of the research, would be informed only of technical progress in pigment analysis. It would be too dangerous to reveal this now. The world wasn't ready for it. They themselves weren't. While the team debated the ethical implications, Numa continued its tireless work. It sought the logic behind the words, the syntax of the secret. And then, at the end of the second day of analysis, a new alert appeared on the screen. It was more significant than the first. The system had discovered something incredible. The letters were not scattered at random. They followed a very specific pattern. On the screen, Numa projected a map of the painting, connecting the location of each text fragment. The lines formed a perfect spiral, starting near Jesus' right hand and expanding outward, touching each disciple in a precise order. It was a mathematical design, a structure based on the golden ratio, the same mathematical signature Leonardo used in all his art. Dr. Rossi looked at the image, feeling a shiver. She realized it instantly. This was more than a message. It was a cipher. He had built a code within the very geometry of the painting. In that moment, the mystery grew even larger. They were no longer dealing with hidden notes. They were facing an architecture of secrets, an intellectual labyrinth left by the greatest genius of the Renaissance. They had just found the entrance. The spiral map glowed on the central monitor, a coil of light drawn over the darkness of the Last Supper. The team looked at the image, and the mural had been transformed into a labyrinth. The isolated words they had found now seemed like breadcrumbs left by Leonardo, and the spiral was the path connecting them. Dr. Alessi broke the silence, his voice firm but charged with a new urgency. He ordered Numa to use the spiral as a reading key and to initiate the syntactic reconstruction protocol, starting at the center and following the pattern to obtain the first complete sentence. The system began to work. It was a process of immense complexity, far beyond a simple translation. Numa needed to bring back a text that had been shattered by time and hidden by genius. The system scanned terabytes of data, isolating each micro-fragment of anomalous pigment along the path of the spiral. For each fragment, it calculated letter probabilities, comparing them with Leonardo's personal vocabulary extracted from his thousands of pages of diaries. It understood not just the words Da Vinci used, but the frequency and context in which he used them. On the screen, sequences of nonsensical words appeared and were discarded in milliseconds. Marco, the team's young data analyst, muttered that it was like trying to hear a whisper in the middle of a hurricane. Numa found dozens of false positives, words formed by random cracks that almost made sense, but the system discarded them for falling outside Leonardo's psychological and linguistic profile. It was a digital battle against 500 years of chaos. Slowly, like an image coming into focus, coherence began to emerge. The machine isolated a series of marks located under the central table, a deep shadow area that most observers ignore. It was the opening segment of the code. Fragments connected. The truth appeared on the screen. The team held their breath. The word hovered there, full of promise and threat. Numa jumped to another point on the spiral, near the robe of another apostle. Processing dragged on for minutes that felt like hours. "Will rise again." The tension in the room was almost physical. Each new word was a victory, but it also increased the fear of what the complete sentence might mean. Then, after nearly an hour of processing, Numa locked the final sequence. The last part of the sentence emerged from a shadow near the floor. The full sentence appeared on the screen, translated from Leonardo's archaic Italian into clear and brutal English. The words hung in the cold lab air. Truth will rise again when reason replaces faith. No one spoke, no one moved. Even the hum of the servers seemed to have vanished into the room's silence. That sentence wasn't an artistic note. It was a declaration of war, a verbal time bomb built by Leonardo and left to detonate 500 years in the future. Dr. Rossi finally sat down, her hand covering her mouth. Her historian's mind saw the phrase not through modern eyes, but through the eyes of the 15th century, a time when men like Giordano Bruno were burned at the stake for much less. With a trembling voice, she said he wasn't just questioning, he was predicting. He knew the church would not last forever in its current form. He believed a time would come when humanity would have the tools to find this message, an era of reason. He was speaking to us. The phrase recontextualized everything. The cracks in the painting ceased to be a sign of decay and became the very time that needed to pass so the secret could be revealed. Dr. Alessi walked to the window, looking out at the Florence night without truly seeing it. He said this changed everything, and that the secrecy protocol was no longer enough. From that moment on, That lab was in digital quarantine with no connection to the outside world. The sentence fell in the room like a stone, and once again, everything changed. If that was only the first sentence, what else was hidden along that spiral? The question hung in the air, terrifying. The painting had transformed into a manifesto, a dangerous document questioning the very foundation of Western civilization. And they, a small group of scientists, were now the only ones who knew it existed. The joy of discovery had evaporated, replaced by the crushing burden of knowledge. The Last Supper was not the end of Jesus' story. It was the beginning of Leonardo da Vinci's secret history. The digital quarantine turned the lab into an island. The outside world continued its routine, oblivious to the earthquake shaking the foundations of history within those walls. The Da Vinci Decoded team now worked with a somber solemnity, driven by a mixture of fear and fascination. The first sentence had changed the mission's objective. They were no longer just discoverers. They had become investigators, and the Last Supper was their only witness, a witness that had remained silent for 500 years. Newma's work continued. Following the trail of digital breadcrumbs left along the geometric spiral, the machine now sought context, not just sentences, and the context was shocking. Newma began to correlate the location of each text fragment with the figure of the nearest disciple. A pattern began to emerge, a structure so audacious that at first the team hesitated to believe it. Leonardo had created a psychological dossier of each of the men sitting at the table. Instead of a single manifesto, the Last Supper functioned as a map of the human soul, with its flaws and deceptions exposed in the shadows for those who knew where to look. The first clear connection was with Judas Iscariot. In the darkness near his figure, Newma isolated a new inscription, more cynical than the first. The translation read, "Traitors are merely tools in the hands of history, and the hand that moves them is the truly guilty one." The phrase was a dagger. It shifted the focus away from Judas, suggesting he was just a pawn in a much larger game. Dr. Rossi looked at the image, at the tormented figure of Judas, and saw something new, perhaps a disposable piece, the first victim of a much broader conspiracy, rather than the one-dimensional villain driven by greed. She pondered that Leonardo was telling them to look beyond the usual culprit. He was pointing to the power that hides behind the throne. The system then moved to Simon Peter, the rock upon which the church was built. Below his imposing figure, in an area of damaged plaster that looked like a mere stain, Newma extracted another phrase, a veiled critique of the very institution Peter would represent, stating that the rock that refuses to see the crack within itself is destined to crumble. It was a warning about the arrogance of certainty, about faith that becomes so hard it loses the ability to question. The phrase echoed the first discovery about reason and faith, but now in a much more personal and targeted way. It was as if Leonardo were predicting centuries of dogmatism and the Church's resistance to the knowledge he himself so fiercely defended. The next focus was Thomas, the apostle whose doubt became his defining characteristic. Tradition saw him as a man of little faith, a flaw to be corrected. But Leonardo apparently saw him in a completely different light. The phrase hidden near his hand was perhaps the most revolutionary of all, a celebration of skepticism, stating that doubt is not the enemy of truth, but its only path. In that moment, Da Vinci's intention became crystal clear. He advocated for the scientific method, critical thinking, and the courage to question instead of attacking religion. He was transforming skepticism's greatest sinner into a hero of reason, the only disciple who embodied the true search for knowledge. With each new discovery, The portrait of Leonardo became more complex and dangerous. He used his most sacred work to hide his most profane treatise, but the most disturbing discovery was still to come. In the lower right corner of the mural, an area notoriously damaged by humidity, Numa detected a longer phrase, almost entirely erased. The reconstruction process was the most difficult yet, requiring the machine to fill gaps based on probabilities and nearly invisible letter fragments. After hours of work, the phrase finally took shape, and this time it spoke about the message itself. It said that these words sleep in the shadow until the eyes of the future discover them. The phrase fell in the room like a stone. This changed everything again. It ceased to be just a logical interpretation by the team and became a confirmation. Leonardo knew they would come. He was sending a message in a bottle across the ocean of time, trusting that a future civilization, armed with the reason he so prized, would have the technology to find it. The team looked at each other, the weight of that revelation crushing them. They were the recipients, much more than mere discoverers. Leonardo da Vinci's 500-year-old prophecy had just been fulfilled. The revelation of the prophecy changed the atmosphere in the lab instantly. The weight of responsibility was now palpable. The team no longer saw themselves as scientists analyzing an object, but as heirs to a testament. Leonardo da Vinci had entrusted them with his most dangerous secret, and they were now its executors. Every look exchanged between them carried the same silent question about what they would do now. Dr. Alessi, feeling the weight of that historical moment, gathered the team. He said they were the eyes of the future he had hoped for, and they could not hesitate. The spiral gave them the context. Now they needed to go to the center, the point of origin of everything. All eyes turned to the screen, to the central figure of Jesus, the focal point of the painting, the epicenter from which the spiral of the message unfolded. Until then, Numa had followed the path outward, decoding the comments about the disciples. Now, the investigation would turn inward, to the heart of the enigma. The order was given for Numa to initiate a maximum resolution scan of the central figure, searching for any anomaly. The final answer had to be there. The system began the most intensive scan yet, a deep dive into the painting's data. But to everyone's surprise, it found nothing. The area of Jesus' robe, unlike the dark and damaged edges of the work, was remarkably well preserved. There were fewer cracks, less fading. Numa deployed its full arsenal: infrared reflectography to search for hidden sketches, X-ray fluorescence to map the chemical elements of the surface. Each scan returned with the same bleak result: negative. The paradox was baffling. Leonardo's secret seemed to depend on imperfection. Where the work was most intact, the silence was absolute. Frustration began to set in. Marco, the data analyst, ran his hand through his hair and suggested that maybe there was nothing there. He had run all the diagnostics and the area was too clean. Perhaps the center was just the starting point. It seemed like a poetic explanation, but to Dr. Rossi, it didn't make sense. She insisted otherwise, walking toward the screen. She said that wasn't the Leonardo she had studied for 30 years. To him, the center was never empty. It was the engine of everything. He wrote in his notebooks that nature abhors a vacuum. The most important secret would be kept in the most important place. She ordered Numa to change the protocol. Her voice cut through the tension. She asked them to stop looking for marks on the paint and to perform a comparative spectrographic analysis of the pigments. Instead of looking for an addition, she suggested looking for a signature within the paint itself. It was a stroke of genius. Dr. Alessi reconfigured the system parameters, and then Numa found it. It was a molecular anomaly, not a crack. It was Marco who saw it first, an anomalous peak in the chromium graph. He called the doctor over to see that the blue of Jesus's robe had a trace of cobalt that didn't exist anywhere else in the painting. It was microscopic, but it was there, like paint, with a drop of another color invisible to the naked eye. Leonardo wove the message into light itself, using chemistry as ink instead of hiding it in the shadows. Using this variation as a code, Numa began to reveal letters that were literally invisible. They were clearer, more deliberate than the others. The master's signature, his final declaration. When the translation appeared on the screen, the room went completely silent. The phrase functioned as the philosophical key to the entire puzzle. It said that truth does not belong to the saints, but to those who seek it in silence. The phrase was the final piece. It dismantled the idea that truth is a divine revelation delivered by sacred figures. To Leonardo, truth was something to be conquered. It was the prize of curiosity, observation, and relentless reason, a human act. In that moment, the team realized the true genius of the message. The Last Supper didn't just speak about the disciples at the table. In some way, it was speaking about them there in the lab. They were the personification of that phrase. They had sought the truth in silence, using reason, and they had found it. The painting functioned as a mirror. Leonardo da Vinci, through 500 years of silence, had just told them that the path they were following was the only one that mattered. The final phrase resonated in the room like a deep whisper that altered reality. The discovery under Jesus's robe was the culmination of the investigation, the key that allowed them to understand the full picture. With all the puzzle pieces on the table, the spiral, the comments on the disciples, the prophecy, and the final declaration, Dr. Alessi turned to Numa for the last and most important task. He ordered the final synthesis protocol to take all the decoded fragments and reconstruct the complete narrative. The system, which had worked for weeks unearthing fragments, now shifted its focus. It ceased to be a digital archaeologist to become a restorer of ideas. Its task was to weave the scattered phrases into a single coherent manifesto, using the spiral as a guide and Leonardo's philosophy as cement. On the main screen, the image of the Last Supper faded, giving way to lines of text that organized themselves slowly. Numa identified the logical progression and the flow of thought that Leonardo had embedded in the painting's geometry, going beyond just joining sentences. The control room became a chamber of witnesses, watching an ancient idea come back to life. The text began with its foundation, the central thesis. It said that truth will rise again when reason replaces faith. Next, Numa began to fit in the comments about the disciples, using them as case studies that supported this thesis. The critique of Peter regarding the cracked rock became a warning about the fragility of dogmatic institutions that break under the weight of their own infallibility. The reinterpretation of Judas as a tool became a lesson in how power manipulates history, creating convenient villains to hide its own guilt. Dr. Rossi murmured in wonder that he was saying, "History is written by the architects of power, not the actors." The praise for Thomas's doubt became the method, the celebration of skepticism as the only honest tool in the search for truth. As the team read, Leonardo's genius was revealed in its totality. They understood the divine irony of the situation. Da Vinci's truth survived because of the cracks and the fading. Time, art's great enemy, had become the involuntary guardian of the secret. Its decay was the perfect camouflage. He had written an entire book within a single image. It was a treatise on power, knowledge, and the liberation of the human spirit through critical thinking. each phrase connected to the next, building an irrefutable argument against blind faith and the tyranny of controlled knowledge. It was the philosophy of a Renaissance man speaking directly to the information age. Finally, Numa integrated the last two pieces. The prophecy about the eyes of the future appeared as a dedication, and the phrase found in the heart of the painting became the conclusion. Numa then executed its final synthesis command, summarizing the essence of the message in a single comprehensive statement. The unwritten title would be, "Faith without reason is the sleep of truth, and those who awaken will see what was forbidden." This final declaration hung in the air. The climax of the entire journey was the time bomb, now fully assembled and ready to explode. Dr. Rossi felt tears in her eyes. Moved by deep admiration, she whispered that he actually did it. He sent the most dangerous message of his time to the future, and it arrived. The silence that followed was the heaviest of all. The joy of discovery and the fear of responsibility merged into a single certainty. Their work in the lab was over. Science had done its part. Now the human dilemma began. The question hanging over them was the most difficult of all. Was the world ready to awaken? The truth was there, complete and irrefutable, contained in a digital file. But the moment they decided to press the send button, nothing would ever be the same. The truth was about to escape the lab, and they knew that once free, it could no longer be controlled. The decision was made in a heavy and deliberate silence that lasted an entire night. The Da Vinci Decoded team gathered one last time in the control room, Leonardo's full manifesto glowing on the screen like a testament. They saw the disclosure as a duty, not an option. Dr. Rossi, her voice low and firm, said he trusted the eyes of the future. To hide this would be the final betrayal. It would prove that humanity is still not ready, that faith in fear is still stronger than reason. They prepared a full dossier with all the raw data, Numa's analysis methodology, and the translation of the manifesto. And then, with a single coordinated click, they released the earthquake. The news exploded instead of leaking. The first publication appeared simultaneously in 3 of the world's most respected scientific journals, with an article detailing the computational analysis of the inscriptions in the masterpiece. Within hours, the story jumped from academia to global media. Headlines mixed disbelief and sensationalism, questioning if artificial intelligence had revealed a secret message and if the Da Vinci Code was real. The painting, which was once a silent icon, suddenly had a voice, and that voice was screaming to be heard. The public's initial reaction was overwhelming fascination. Museums around the world projected the hidden phrases onto replicas of the painting, and people queued for blocks to see the words that had slept in the shadows for 500 years. People began to see the cracks as the writing of time itself, the lines on a map that finally led to a treasure. The work's imperfection had become its greatest perfection. Leonardo was not defeated by time. He used it as an accomplice. Social media ignited with debates. For many, the discovery functioned as a different kind of spiritual revelation, the confirmation that the search for truth was a path as sacred as faith. University courses in art history and theology were revised overnight, but the fascination quickly gave way to controversy. More conservative religious groups denounced the discovery as a dangerous hoax. Theologians debated whether Leonardo's words criticized the institution of the church or the very idea of God. Politicians used the discovery to defend their own agendas. Leonardo's message, which spoke about the danger of power, ironically became a new weapon in the battle for power. The Vatican, caught in the center of the storm, issued a cautious statement after days of silence. They recognized the scientific validity of the discovery, but interpreted Leonardo's words as the artistic reflections of a complex man of faith. It was a masterful attempt to neutralize the bomb, to absorb the message into the official narrative, transforming a revolutionary's manifesto into the diary of a tormented artist. But it was too late. Truth, once freed, could not be recaptured. In the laboratory in Florence, the team observed the chaos they had unleashed. They were hounded by the press, hailed as heroes by some, and condemned as villains by others. But they remained silent, letting the data speak for itself. Their work was done. Leonardo's prophecy had been fulfilled. His eyes of the future had found the message. In the end, the Last Supper remained unchanged, still hanging on the wall of the ancient hall in Milan. The colors remained faded, the figures still seated at the table, but no one looked at it the same way anymore. People now saw through the layers, glimpsing the invisible spiral, the words hidden in the shadows, the philosophy woven into the paint itself. The painting ceased to be just a biblical meal to become a symbol of a conversation that spanned 500 years. Leonardo da Vinci, the master of secrets, believed that truth was always hidden in plain sight, waiting for those with the courage to look. He planted a seed of reason in the soil of faith, trusting that one day it would bloom. Thanks to a machine he could never have imagined, his voice was finally heard as a resonant call to the future rather than a faint echo of the past. The secret only slept. It was never lost. And now the world had finally awakened. If you enjoyed this investigation, your subscription to the channel and any donation amount helps us expand Project Numa. We would love to read your reflection on the video subject in the comments and your suggestion for the next topic to be covered. Tell us which city you're watching from. Thank you for staying with us until the end. M.